Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a Friday, so really appreciate you giving us some time on your Friday night to spend it with us here, talking some extemp, talking your NATS 20 prep. I am Yatesh Singh. I'm the head coach at Lakefield North High School in Minnesota. So I'll start this slideshow here. Hopefully you're all able to see this on screen. I am the curriculum director for extemp speaking at ISD. This is my third year with ISD. And although we are transitioning to a little bit new space with the online campus experience, our goal is to offer extemp speaking for regardless of your experience level, so that you're able to find growth and development in the activity more generally, but with a specialized focus on the event of extemp speaking. As you can see, I'm from Lakefield North in Minnesota. My students are all from the Lakeville area, which is a suburb outside Minneapolis, but I myself live in Minneapolis. So these last few days have been a bit of an experience with our city, having undergone some significant changes and trauma. And so, yeah, it's a little fraught to try to keep up with what's going on here, what's going on in the city. But we have an opportunity to talk extemp and some of the other challenges that we're facing collectively and how that impacts the activity. So we'll break down this session a little bit into two different ways. First is how you prepare for extemp in the online environment for the tournament. Literally, I mean in terms of the space in which you are operating, how you are preparing mentally, and then the second half we'll talk a bit more specific to how you approach pandemic and other issues related to it. So let's start with the how you prepare for the tournament itself. All of you clearly have been using Zoom as you're here tonight. Your practices, if you are not able to do in-person practice with your coaches, I'm assuming it is likely through Zoom or FaceTime or any one of the other teleconference services. These are fantastic services. What they do is provide you a lot of opportunity to connect, but obviously it's a very different experience than what you have when you're in person. So it's important to be testing the service that we will get to use, the Classroom Connect service, to get familiar with it. It's an overlay that utilizes Zoom services. So if you haven't been practicing using Zoom software, in these next couple of weeks, you definitely want to be giving that a try. I'm not sure how often you're utilizing the speakers and the microphone on your computer versus other devices. For example, today I'm using AirPods to make sure that I've got a better microphone than the one that's on my computer. But computers vary in terms of the technologies. So you want to be testing those to make sure what you have gives you the best opportunity. If you have an option that is better than the one that's in your computer, I recommend using it. But ultimately, it's important to recognize that what you have in terms of options may be different than others. And so if you have that option, if you have that opportunity, make sure to utilize it if it's within your budget. In terms of the spaces in which you're speaking, you want to make sure that you have good lighting. You want to be seen as a speaker. I know extemp is kind of a gray area in terms of an event where we do a lot of that feels much more like debate, but still there's reliance on the speaking skills that you see in those other speech events. So it's important that you are well lit, that your audience can see you, that you are focusing on all of those visual elements that makes you easier for your audience to see. If you've watched any of the videos from the TOC that was held back in April, there's a range in terms of experiences with how students presented themselves in those rounds. Debaters, a lot of them you saw the top of a head, or especially with like those policy debaters. But then when you get to the speech events, extemp particularly, you had folks who are speaking to the camera and giving both delivery as well as a strong argument. And so if you haven't, recommend watching and learning from those speakers. It's a great opportunity just to see how others have approached the visual medium and how to utilize the speaking space and with utilizing Zoom. A couple examples that I found particularly useful is looking at folks like Kay Rollins. She utilized a lot of natural light, and so that helps, I think, avoid a lot of glare, both on the screen and then like reflection off of clothes and whatnot. So natural light always is a good element there. You also want to have a minimal background. You don't want a lot happening behind you. If you have a lot happening behind you, unfortunately, that draws your audience's attention away from you. It is easy to get fixated on, hey, what's going on in that picture back there? Or what are the books on that shelf? So you want to have limited items in the background, but it's also useful not to just have a plain white background. That also can be a little boring. The next element is what you do in terms of your prep space. When you are preparing speeches, the expectation, if you've not read through the rules for nationals, includes that you are available on camera and are able to share your screen immediately upon request by the proctors running the prep rooms. So you want to make sure that you're in a space where you're able to make those adjustments quickly, but then you're also visible to your audience. I know that feels probably a little uncomfortable to be consistently potentially being watched, but it's ultimately part of the game. Your prep space, I recommend not doing it on your bed, like not just laying on your bed. If you're going to be prepping in your bedroom, there's an urge, there's a tendency to want to feel more comfortable because it is such a familiar space. You don't want to get too comfortable in your prep space. If you have a desk, that's a little bit better, but you ultimately want to feel slightly uncomfortable in the sense that you want to get yourself in the mindset that you are preparing for competition. When you are relaxed, you have the potential to feel more unfocused. You don't feel that sense of urgency that you would when you're in the prep room. So you want to make sure that you are recreating rather that prep room feel, so that you are mentally preparing for your draws and then for preparing your speech. The other obvious element to anticipate is having space on your desk or whatever space where you are preparing, so that you have a notepad. And you're also expected to be timing yourself both for your prep and then for your speeches. So you want to make sure that you have easy access to the timer. If it's on your phone or if it's a different device, you want to make sure that's always visible to you. So, plan ahead. We obviously have 2 weeks till national, so this is a good time to be determining what is your prep space going to look like. The next item is you want to be looking at your speaking space from where you will perform your speech. The NSTA, if you've read the notes for the tournament, does give you the option to stand or speak, or stand or sit so when you're speaking. I've told my students that I would recommend standing because that's how they learned extemp to begin with, and that's all of their training, all of their competitive experience has been from a standing position. So it makes sense to continue where they've in what's been the most comfortable and the most familiar experience in terms of extemp. The online experience is dramatically different in a lot of ways, but to the degree that you can minimize how different it feels from traditional competition, the better. So if standing to speak is an option available to you, I recommend taking that. In terms of the space where you're speaking, you want it to be relatively close to where you're preparing. You obviously don't want to have to walk, down a flight of stairs into a different room. It may be the next room over from where you're prepping, but you don't want it to be a long distance. You want to make sure that you're minimizing the challenges and complications getting from point A to point B. Obviously, when we're at nationals, it's different with moving from the prep room to the competition spaces. But if you have the opportunity to limit that space or limit those complications, limit that walking time from A to B, take that opportunity, make it as easy as possible for yourself. When possible, spend time delivering practice speeches in that space that you intend to use for competition. You want to be as comfortable and as familiar with speaking in that space as possible. Most of you have probably had a fair number of rounds where rooms have some awkward elements to them. You want to test the space for echoes and dead spots and whatnot. You want to make sure that you know what complications may exist in that space so that you can avoid them as necessary. And again, we have 2 weeks, so it doesn't hurt, and you've got an ample opportunity to prepare for that. So that's one of the benefits of online competition relative to the in-person tournament, is that you do get a chance to test more speaking spaces, so you know exactly what you're going to be working with. One other element is make sure that you do some practice speeches, whether it's with coaches or teammates or friends. You're giving speeches in those spaces so that they also can view your speaking there and can give you some feedback on the space itself. Some of it may be what's the better angle in which to speak in that space for lighting and whatnot. Some other elements is like how much volume to have in order for your microphones to be picking up key at a good volume. So utilize feedback, because we can judge ourselves to a degree, but ultimately having an audience that can give you some of that feedback is essential to understanding how well it came through. Next is internet prep. So when you're preparing, obviously you need to be connected to the internet because you need to be in the prep room, the virtual prep room. And you want to make sure that your connection is always solid. You want to make sure that there's no disruptions or as few as possible. So first things first, if you can connect directly to your wireless router, if your router is wireless, if you can plug in using an Ethernet cable, that avoids any complications you have with Wi-Fi, where sometimes Wi-Fi can get spotty or it can go out for a little bit. If you're plugged in directly, that's ideal for limiting any sort of challenges there. Additionally, I know a lot of folks will have others at home, especially with some of these stay-at-home orders, depending on where you live. You may have multiple family members at home when you're competing. To the degree possible, try to limit or ask them to limit their use of internet during those times when you are prepping and speaking. You don't want to have you don't want to lose bandwidth from an element within your home if it's avoidable. Third option or third element is, like I said, sometimes you're going to have some internet connectivity issues. You want to make sure that you have as limited impact by that those connectivity issues as possible when you're preparing. The proctors will, of course, be accommodating as possible, understanding that internet connectivity is not always ideal. But when it comes to preparing your speeches, you want to make sure that you are not entirely reliant on the internet as well. If you're using Prepped or if you're using Dropbox, whatever your filing system is, make sure you have a copy of files that are available to you offline in case you have internet issues. You want to make sure that you have at least some files available to you so that you've got sources that you can be utilizing even in the most challenging of circumstances. The 2020 tournament is going to have internet access in terms of prep so that you're able to use online sources. They weren't planning on having it for this year, but it obviously needs to be an option with you being connected anyways to the internet. And so that gives you access to more resources in the event you don't have enough in your files. But to the degree possible, make sure that you have offline sourcing for any potential disruptions you may have in terms of internet service. In these next 2 weeks, it's also important and I think useful to try some different scenarios with internet connectivity issues. Your internet connection may be really good at home, but you want to make sure that it is still, or you still want to plan for what may happen. For what the unforeseen circumstances. You may have slow internet that's outside your control, and so you want to make sure you are practicing with doing maybe dry preps with just limited files or no files. Make sure that you are getting used to different circumstances that are unexpected to you. You may draw a question that you have nothing in your files, and so you want to prepare for that circumstance and how well and how effective can you be in preparing in a panic. And so that when you do that next week, or if you do that this weekend, it's more difficult then than it is at the tournament. You want to make sure that you've gone through those different types of scenarios beforehand, so it feels more comfortable, recognizing that it will still be a challenge. But the more experience you have with some of those challenges, the better. All right. The second half of our session tonight is going to focus a bit more on how to prepare for nationals, more specific to the topics. So ideally, you've been preparing for nationals. I know for a lot of folks, you are now out of school. You finished finals. Some states, you're still in school. I know here in Minnesota, today was the last day for seniors at my school, but underclassmen have another week and a half, I believe. In some states like New York, it's different challenges for different folks in terms of availability for practicing and preparing. But what you want to be doing for these next 2 weeks is adapting to the challenges and circumstances you have, whether it's work, whether it's school. You want to make sure that you are setting aside time for how to prepare. I think the first element you want to be doing is mapping out what do these next 2 weeks look like. There's a lot of different elements to how you prepare these next 2 weeks. I'd recommend first is looking at what are the things that are in your control. There may be some elements that are just not an option in these next 2 weeks. Recognize that it's good to identify what those are, and then don't dwell on those because they're outside your control. it's not something to spend to dedicate time to. Instead, be looking at what are the elements that are addressable in these 2 weeks. So what you want to be doing is identifying strengths, your weaknesses, and then once you have those lined up, what do you need to be working on? So at this point, you have all the topic areas for the tournament. We won't have the order for the rounds for a bit, I believe, but you do have the topic areas. So it's important first to start brainstorming subtopics for all of the round themes. When you have 13 rounds, there's a lot of questions to be written. I believe it is. They're looking to have 25 questions written per round. So brainstorming subtopics for each round is essential to understanding what can happen in that round. There will be no duplicate questions across rounds. So if there's a question about Brazil in the South America round, that question will only show up there. There may be some different questions about Brazil in other rounds where it's relevant, but ultimately there will only be one there will only be one instance of a question for the entire tournament. So brainstorming those subtopics, seeing how broad a round theme can be, is essential to understanding and anticipating questions. And it's important to recognize that ultimately the brainstorming you do helps you wrap your head around the topic area, but you'll likely still see some questions that feel like even push the boundaries even after you've done a lot of brainstorming. Still, doesn't hurt to try to explore those topics as much as possible, those round themes as much as possible, to reduce the unexpected. This year, the NSDA is doing the question writing process a little bit differently. They've tapped a number of folks, extemp coaches from around the country, to brainstorm the questions, and most of the questions will have been written this month in May. Some questions will be written in June in the 2 weeks preceding the tournament, but to a large degree, the questions were written in May. So there'll be some questions that'll feel super relevant and timely. So like you may see some questions about police brutality, because it is timely at this point, and it'll likely continue to be timely for these next 2 weeks preceding the tournament. But you'll also see some questions that were written in early May that are a little bit more broad, so its relevance continues and persists through the national tournament. There's this year, because the tournament is entirely online, they don't have to write they don't have to print questions and cut the slips and stuff envelopes and all of those details. So the questions you'll see a lot more questions, I think, that'll feel a little bit more timely, a little bit more, have a lot more recency than typically, but still anticipate what are rounds or what are topics that are relevant at this point in May, because those questions will also be in the envelopes. They're not going to leave the questions to the very end, to that week of leading up to the national tournament to write those questions, because these are coaches of students and programs around the country. That week that leads up to the national tournament, chances are they're judging rounds. The supplemental events have their prelim rounds that week before the official tournament, so they're going to have their hands full with that and helping their students record if they're competing in prepared speech events. They'll be practicing with their students for extemp and for the debate events. So I'd say the vast majority of the questions should be written well before that week. So anticipate some more broader questions that are written in May. The next element useful to anticipate is when you're mapping out your plan. So once you've brainstormed all those questions, be looking in your files, see where gaps exist in your files, and map out in that plan which, of all the areas that need to be filled, set aside, I'll do these 3 topics today, these 3 the next day. Make sure you're planning out the next 2 weeks so that it doesn't feel like you are trying to get everything done those last couple of days before the tournament. You want to make sure that you set aside that plan so that you are pacing yourself throughout the process. The national tournament is a long experience when it's in person, and it'll be a long experience when you are competing online. And so you want to make sure that by setting aside some time each day to prepare, and in terms of files and doing practice speeches and whatnot, that you do not burn yourself out, either right before the tournament or find yourself burning out the first day of competition. So that element of mapping what those next 2 weeks really is about pace. And then I think the last thing to make sure that you are thinking about is that what you've done has gotten you to this stage. So you're qualified at nationals. The work you've done has been effective. Now the question is, what elements are under your control, and what can you continue working on to continue the success you've had. There's a lot of challenges that are, and a lot of elements that are outside your control. Don't dwell on those. Focus on what is in your control, what's gotten you this far, and keep building on that. Like I said, I've got that 4th bullet point says avoid the urge to scrap everything and start over. You've got a filing system that you are not necessarily happy with. Now is not the time to try to change that. Now is the time to make some corrections, adapt a little bit to improve it as necessary. But ultimately, you've got 2 weeks to prepare, and you want to make sure that you are utilizing that time as effectively as possible for your growth, so that you continue your progress. That does not mean starting over anything new in that sense. And then the other thing, I guess one last element in terms of preparing, this is a time when you can still add a few new things that may be different from what you've been doing in terms of prep. We've all been doing online instruction and learning for the past couple months here. So we've all experienced Zoom fatigue, that you can only have so much screen time, and then it just feels like a drain and you feel exhausted. That's important to recognize, that your prep shouldn't be spent all day in front of a screen. But there are other ways in which you can continue your growth. If you are not a person who listens to podcasts, consider downloading some pods, listening to some news that way. That's one way in which you can continue learning more topics without needing the screen time. There's a lot of podcasts, especially news-oriented ones, that can help you grow. NPR has a couple, like The Indicator and Planet Money have really good ones in terms of economics and giving human stories. Those are one really useful ways to in terms of the economy and other elements. And then there's a lot of international relations ones and other news podcasts. So figure out where you're deficient, where you're feeling like you need to learn a little bit more, and then see what podcasts exist out there. Most think tanks have some podcasts out there. Most news publications have some podcasts as well. So, like if, for example, if Asia is a continent where you feel like you just don't have as much knowledge on and want to learn more, The Diplomat is a great source for Asian news. But then also their podcast gives a lot of good, brief but very effective deep dives into some issues. So look to see what options are available to you that don't require sitting in front of a screen to learn a lot. All right. This last part, we're going to talk a fair bit about COVID-19, the pandemic that has changed everything for us. Ideally, you are an extemper who files on a regular basis, that you are not just utilizing internet prep every time you are speaking and competing. If you are filing, it gives you an opportunity to be reading a fair bit of news, getting more familiar with topics as they happen, when incidents happen, when issues arise. Problem with the last couple of months has been there's not much that's getting published unless it is COVID-19 or it is politics, whether it's our 2020 elections or politics in some other countries. And then it feels like everything else is maybe 5% coverage of the news that's out there. You want to make sure that your files do not show that type of breakdown. You want to be proactive in looking for writing that's happening on other topics that are not just new. You don't want half your files to be COVID-19 pandemic items, just because that's not going to be all of the questions at nationals. I know it will probably feel like it's an outsized or a larger portion of the questions will have some sort of element of COVID-19 to it, but you want to make sure that your filing is not entirely anticipating all questions you draw are about the pandemic or pandemic related. If I remember correctly, the pandemic itself is a round theme unto itself, is a specific round, but it will have implications in other rounds. So when you are preparing for a speech in competition, you want to be looking at the questions and asking yourself, is this a question that is directly about COVID-19? Is it indirectly about COVID-19? Does COVID-19 play a role in this question, or at least in the answer to the question? Or is it actually entirely unrelated to the question? The direct question would be obviously an example, like how well has the US managed the COVID-19 outbreak? A question that would be entirely unrelated would be, questioning the Chinese policy and escalation towards Hong Kong in recent days. I think it's fair to say that the Chinese interests in Hong Kong have largely remained the same regardless of the pandemic. But now the pandemic probably provides some sort of governance. As the international community is a bit preoccupied, but ultimately Chinese policy towards Hong Kong is not. And so that'd be an example, I think, probably an example where you probably don't have any COVID-19 analysis if it is specific to the Chinese policy. Indirect questions, I think, are tricky. I think this is where you have the possibility of misjudging a question, or at least viewing a question potentially differently than your judge or your judges rather. And so I think the best way to be looking at these questions is, how does COVID-19 interact with the question? If you have the question, what are the biggest challenges facing restaurants? Obviously, they've been harmed by the pandemic in a number of different ways. Your points may be focusing on suppliers to restaurants. So a lot of the food supply chain has been disrupted by the pandemic. You may also have a point about depressed customer turnout and how that may persist. And then your third point might be about the challenges that restaurants face when it comes to paying rent. For a lot of restaurants, they've been closed for a month, or they've just not had the revenue to cover their rent payments to the degree that they otherwise would have. So the pandemic has obviously had some direct implications for food suppliers. It has had direct implications on customer turnout, but the rent payment element is not COVID-19 specific. So you'd want to have analysis that utilizes the pandemic, but you don't want to over focus on the pandemic. You want to recognize where that balance is in terms of its impact, and then also look at what are the outside elements that affect the issue. If you are looking at restaurants more generally pre-pandemic, they were low margin to begin with in terms of profit. Often restaurants are operating on a month-to-month basis. They are not sitting with significant reserves in terms of cash to cover expenses. And so those understanding what were the biggest challenges facing restaurants prior to the pandemic, and then recognizing how the pandemic has affected those challenges that they face now. It gives you, I think, a lot of insight, and then also ensures that you are answering a question in a way that your audience also anticipates. I know we as extempers will often follow the literature as closely as possible and look for the answers there. It is always, I think, useful to ask yourself when you're looking at a question, how would I have answered this pre-pandemic? You know, what would the literature have said pre-pandemic? And I recognize that a lot of that literature is, you know, outdated to a degree that you wouldn't necessarily use it in a speech, but recognizing how the pandemic is uniquely affected an issue gives you, I think, a little bit more in terms of insight that your audience will appreciate, your judge will appreciate. Your judges, as being coaches and having more just life experiences, will often look at these questions from a bit of a different perspective than you necessarily with your life experiences. And so thinking a little bit more holistically pre-pandemic versus pandemic, how factors changed gives you, I think, it will help give you a bit of a better understanding of the topic, and then I think that'll come through in your speech. Another example where we can talk about that would be if you look in Hungary, Viktor Orban has consistently made efforts to solidify his control of power and to become more authoritarian in terms of consolidate his power. And the pandemic has provided a unique opportunity to do that more effectively, but his motivations were always there, and his efforts were always there. And so the challenge in that question would be looking at how did he capitalize on the pandemic to consolidate power more effectively in these past couple months relative to previously. And then the last piece of advice in terms of COVID-19 is, when you are looking at questions, what is the human element? This week we reached 100,000 deaths in the U.S., and that's devastating when you think about how many lives were lost. When we lost the first couple thousand, when we reached that 3,000 mark, that the pandemic eclipsed the total number of deaths from 9/11. For a lot of folks, that was gut-wrenching. But as the death total has increased and increased and increased, it feels like it has become a little less connected to us. It feels like it is more a statistic and not as much a tragedy when we see as many deaths, and we're seeing, I think it's still averaging 1,200 a day. You want to make sure that when you are speaking on these issues, whether it's pandemic related or it's otherwise, you want to make sure that you're still trying to provide a human element to the stories. Your audience, you don't know what background they're bringing with them into the room, and you want to make sure that you're speaking to these in a way that that gives these stories a human element to them. There's a lot of folks who've experienced food insecurity. There's a lot of folks in our community that, in the speech and debate community, that experience food insecurity, and that's something that they experienced pre-pandemic, but it's been amplified by the pandemic, by the challenges we're facing from distance learning, not having access to school lunches and whatnot. And so you want to make sure that you are not just simply relying on statistics. I know our media gives a lot of numbers, and it helps frame a lot of issues for us through numbers, but you want to make sure that you are still providing that human element to the questions you draw. How do these issues affect Americans, or how do they affect Brazilians? audience or whomever is involved in your question. To the degree possible, you want to make sure that you are sharing not just the argument, but you are sharing their stories with those speeches, and that I think helps bridge the gap of online to in person in a large degree. We're speaking from various places around the country, or actually around the world. You'll have competition from all over the place, but that human element, when you can bring it into a speech, I think really helps bring you that much closer to your audience, despite the distance. And so, when possible, look for ways in which to make that story feel more real, make those experiences feel more real for your audience. Yeah, so that's what I've got in terms of our lecture today for our seminar for how to prepare in the pandemic for the national tournament. This summer we've got ISD with 2 sessions online. Got the dates there on the screen for you. And as you can see, we've got a couple different options for you, 1-week and 2-week options for to accommodate your schedules. I guess at this point, do we have any? We can do some open mic questions.
If anyone has questions, you can send them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask away.
Peter asks, how many speeches a week should be our baseline? I think that's a tough question to depend. I think it really depends on your availability and what you feel is, or like where your comfort level is. So like one of my students who's competing at nationals in a couple of weeks, she's working 60 hours a week right now. She works at Home Depot and she's considered an essential worker, and so her availability is much more limited. And so she would be able to pull off, I think, a speech a day. But if you have the time, you have the energy to be giving 3 speeches a day and don't feel like you are wearing yourself out, if your plan for these next 2 weeks is focusing more on delivery elements, 3 speeches a day might be more useful to you. I think that question really depends on both your goals in these next couple of weeks, but then also what you can offer without or can do without burning out. Grace asks, what type of questions should we expect for the art, entertainment, and society topic area? Ooh, to be honest, I have not looked at that. I don't have any students in USX, so I have just kind of stayed away from those. There were years ago, I'll say this was 12, 14 years ago, we used to have a pop culture round at nationals, and those questions, they would get out there in terms of range. There would be Britney Spears questions and whatnot. I would anticipate the questions for this round probably to be a little bit more politically conscious. Mm-hmm. I would say that it is looking more at questions that are relevant to us in a public sphere. So it is not about the Kanye Taylor beef. as much as it may be more about the role that social media influencers or musical artists have in terms of shaping conversation around race or around inequities or politics. And I'd say it's probably look more at that, and um, where some of the literature is going there. I'd say to a large degree, you want to be looking at what are you seeing in the New York Times and the Washington Post and some of those key sources that extempers use often. And if you're seeing a lot of writing on that, chances are your question writers are as well. And so that's driving their questions. Ultimately, when writing questions, myself, or either for this, for nationals or for other tournaments, the one thing that I'm always going to be looking for is what does the literature say, and does that make it a predictable question for the competitors? And so then I'm writing that question. I'm not looking at what was one article that was written by The Economist and then running with that. Every so often there will be some folks who will write a question that is based on an article they saw in The Economist. But if it's there, chances are others are writing about it as well.
I would also say, like, Yatesh, like Colin Kaepernick, I think falls into society questions, especially now. Like, I think that would be relevant. I think that the Me Too movement and sort of evaluating it probably for a certain amount of time, like, might be something that you could see. And also, like, these industries specifically have been hammered hard by the pandemic as well. So questions about, like, television shooting schedules and things like that, and like how do some of these smaller producers and stuff actually survive. So I think you could get really interesting questions, but I definitely think it's going to be more politically connected.
Yeah, I think the thing I'd mention on that is just the cascade effects with the pandemic on movie theaters, movie production, the role of streaming services, and how that may impact a lot of. So yeah, like I said, there's a lot of potential in that. It feels like a pretty open-ended, especially with that and society part at the end of the round theme, that I think gives a lot of potential there. See, the next question I see here is from Rahil. How do we deal with questions that sound relatively easy on the surface, but we can't go more than 2 points? That's tough. Yeah, there's always some questions where you're like, this feels like there's you can knock it out of the park with 2. Ideally, you are using 3 points, but sometimes, and this is probably more true on the college level than in high school, that extempers will utilize a 2-point structure. It feels a little different for us because we think in threes. We naturally gravitate to threes, a series of 3, and so you'll want to have a third. To a large degree, you're going to want to look at what the literature is on your topic. If there's a very weak point, it's still a point, and that you can put that in the middle. If that's your second point, you start strong, you end strong, and chances are your judge to a degree will overlook the second point being relatively weak to the other 2. They will notice that it'll feel a bit weaker. It'll probably be a little shorter. Its impact may be weaker than the other 2. But if you have the ability to get that third point through the literature, even if it's a weaker one, you've got that. It's also worth looking at if you have 2 strong points. Is one of them a broader point than the other? If so, there's probably a way in which you can reorganize that to be 2 points. And it really comes down, it's a case-by-case basis, with looking at different questions and what the points would be. But I'd say those are probably your 2 best ways in getting to 3 points. Joe Rankin asks, based on perhaps your experience at the TOC with Extemp, how do you feel delivery will be considered in Extemp in this online environment? Practice is definitely key, but wondering on what judges might be looking for considering so many different physical environments. I didn't judge as a TOC, so I can't speak to what prefaces judges there received. I've judged at a few other tournaments since then, a couple of district tournaments for qualifiers for nationals, and then like the mask tournament that was hosted by the Night Talk folks, just judged that a couple weeks ago. And each time I judged, I was given notes by the tab room about what to anticipate and what not to factor into judging, and so like looking at elements like the quality of audio, or like asking judges to recognize that those factors may be outside the control of students. Everything I know about the NSDA, I anticipate that they will give similar instructions to coaches and judges to say that these are the elements that may challenge a student in terms of the competition process, and try overlook those, recognize that those may be out of their control, and not to weigh those against the student. Obviously, when you have the ability to control some of those factors, if it is utilizing a headset that improves the quality of your audio, you want to go for that. But I think, and I hope that the NSDA will give judges, give them that warning that, hey, these are things that you shouldn't look at, and that you should not weigh against a student because they may be outside their control. I'm anticipating that if you have the ability to walk, to stand and to walk when performing, that you'll want to do so, because it's just what we've in the activity have anticipated and expected of our speakers for so long, in person, when we were competing in person. I think it is worth, if you're able to do so, to go back to walking. This isn't necessarily true for all speakers, but when I'm working with my own students, I'm always having them walking when they're practicing their speeches before they deliver, so that they create that mind, that connection between in their mind with walking and where they are in their speeches, so that helps them with their memorization. So if they have a memory flub and they need to just get to the next point, walking to that next point will help jog their memory. Okay, this is where I pick up where I left off, or this is where I'm going to start point 2, and then they get back on track. So if possible, I'd say be walking, be standing for your speeches, and go from there. But yeah, if sitting is sitting is your preference when delivering, and I know that is becoming much more common in debate, in some formats of debate. Ideally, your judges won't hold that against you, but ultimately, judges' preferences vary. It's something we've always experienced when we're at tournaments, in person or otherwise, and so it's always the luck of the draw when it comes to what your judges' preferences are. And so I'd say always aim for as big a bullseye as possible in terms of doing what is the traditional norms and what's most commonly expected. Let's see the next question. What kind of questions should we expect for the rounds that are solely based on the COVID-19 pandemic? I would say if the round theme is like looking at the pandemic as a whole, it's probably questions that are more broadly focused on the pandemic. So general coordination of strategy across countries, if you're in IX, or how well is the White House, or like coordination from the White House on the pandemic, how well have they managed that? How well is the CDC operated through this pandemic, where previous pandemics like Ebola and SARS, they were much more out front and a much bigger source of information and guidance and direction, where this one they've not. And so I'd say that's probably that type of question you'd expect there, as opposed to in other rounds. In South America, you may see questions that are about Brazil related to the pandemic because Bolsonaro is handling that very uniquely differently. And I'd say that that probably would show up in the South America round and not necessarily the pandemic round. Vikash asks, how far out do you think the questions are written for nationals? Started, I believe, the beginning of May, the question writing process. And I would say they're probably 75% written at this point, with the last 25% these next 2 weeks. Just anticipating just the length of time between May 1st and the start of the tournament. So that's probably what I'd guess the split in terms of questions written in May versus June. Michelle asks if there'd be COVID-19 questions in the geographic round topics. I think so. There's not nearly enough happening, I think, or there's been so much focus on the pandemic in so many countries and in so many regions that it's crowded out focus on other issues, both like in terms of the news, but then also like on a policy level with implementation of policy from governments, that I think there'll be some COVID-19 questions in each round, but they'll be unique to those rounds so that it doesn't duplicate what you see in other rounds, so that you're not giving the same speech in multiple rounds. Let's see, Rahil asks, do you have any idea on how prep will work in general? There's a document, if you go onto the national tournament website, there's a procedures document that is like 18, 19 pages in length. And so it gives details for each event on how they work. And I believe there's a section for extemp speaking about the prep room process. So they're going to have, I believe, 3 prep rooms that divide up all the speakers so that proctors are not having to manage all the extempers all in one space where they would at nationals. And so then those proctors will have you continuously be on screen, but then they at any time can ask you to share your screen. And the expectation is that you immediately hit the screen share button so that they can see what you're working on and what you have up and what you don't have up to ensure that you are not utilizing prohibited services. Specifically, you're not supposed to be having access to communication with others, live communication with others. You are expected to be using internet prep, the internet to like search for articles, and access to your files, whether it is online or offline, and that's it. And then your follow-up there. Prep is you have internet prep this year. They were not going to have it, but you are welcome to use the internet in your prep this year because we're competing online. So if you are in if you're in a region where internet prep has been a norm in your circuit, then it'll feel a bit more familiar to you. If you have not utilized internet prep before, recommend definitely utilizing it a bit in these next 2 weeks, where so that it is a bit more of so you feel more comfortable for those speeches where you may draw a question and you don't have enough in the files to answer it. One recommendation, if you have not used internet prep before, always start your speech and your prep the way you normally would. Be looking in their files. What do you have in your files that helps you answer the question you've drawn? Exhaust your offline resources first, if that's your traditional experience, and then go online to find additional sources to help you finish your prep. You want to make sure that as much of it as possible is done in your comfort zone, utilizing the prep as you've done it before, and then figure out what more you need to supplement the work you've done. You also want to make sure that you are keeping a closer eye on time when you're using internet prep, because it is very easy to fall down a rabbit hole and suddenly find yourself having used 20 minutes when you were only planning to use 10. So you want to make sure that you keep a close eye on your time. so that it does not trade off with the rest of your prep. Any other questions that you all can think of?
Great. Well, thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Thanks to Yatesh. I will upload this to the YouTube channel and will be available to folks who weren't able to watch it live in the next few hours. And we hope you have a great national tournament, and we hope to see you at ISD this summer. And if you have any questions about ISD Online, feel free to email us at staff@isbcinnovate.com or stop by the Nationals Expo in a few weekends from now. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great evening.